pursuit of freedom, boldly telling the truth in a time of universal deceit.
Can I tell you something? I got to tell you one thing. If you expect the freedom that you say is yours, prove that you deserve it. Help us to preserve it. For being free will just be words and nothing more.
The Pursuit of Freedom with your host, Phil Pepin.
Freedom in America has an enemy far greater than Muslim terrorist or some hostile nation. That enemy has done more to set this country on the course towards tyranny than any corrupt politician has. The enemy is from within, and its name is ignorance. Thomas Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. America's government-run public school system is an unmitigated failure. Millions of American children spend 12 years of their lives in the system, and many can't even master the most basic skills, including a complete lack of understanding of their own country's history. George Washington had no formal education. Ben Franklin only had 2 years of formal education and became a statesman, author, publisher, scientist, inventor, and diplomat. Most Americans have been conditioned to think we must have a government-run public school system and have been taxed heavily to create it. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute conducted a civics literacy survey, and it yielded a stunning result. They found that as poorly as the general public scored on their understanding of American history, elected officials scored significantly lower. That reveals a lot about the type of people attracted to political power. Here's an audio clip of a candidate who was considered a serious contender for the 2012 Republican presidential nomination.
We don't need to rewrite the Constitution of the United States. We need to reread the Constitution and enforce the Constitution. And I know that there are some people that are not going to do that. So for the benefit of those that are not going to read it because they don't want us to go by the Constitution, there's a little section in there that talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know those ideals that we live by, we believe in, your parents believed in, they instilled in you. When you get to the part about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, don't stop right there. Keep reading. Because that's when it says, when any form of government becomes destructive of those ideals, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it.
Herman Cain didn't know the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Isn't it interesting that Ron Paul, the only candidate that has reverence and an expert-level understanding of the Constitution, was mocked and ridiculed? With rare exceptions, government attracts people who lust for power, not those who love freedom and understand the Constitution. Modern politicians are treated like rock stars. That's why it's important to understand the greatest political myth in American history, the myth of Abraham Lincoln. The truth about the real Lincoln will be hard for many Americans to accept, but my guest, who has done extensive research using historical documents and Lincoln's own words, shows a man who is America's greatest tyrant, not one of our greatest presidents. Pursuit of Freedom welcomes Tom Dilorenzo, economics professor at Loyola University Maryland, a senior fellow at Ludwig von Mises Institute, and associate scholar at Abbeville Institute. He holds a Ph.D. in economics from Virginia Tech. He's a best-selling author. Some of his books are The Real Lincoln, A New Look at Abraham Lincoln, His Agenda, and Unnecessary War. Lincoln Unmasked, What You're Not Supposed to Know About Dishonest Abe. Hamilton's Curse, How Jefferson's arch enemy betrayed the American Revolution and what it means for Americans today. And his most recent book, Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. Mr. Dilorenzo, welcome to the Pursuit of Freedom.
I'm pleased to be with you, Phil.
The Real Lincoln was the first of your books I have read. I have to be honest with you, when my father-in-law gave me a copy as a gift back in 2007, I refused to read it for almost a year. I supported Ron Paul for president at the time, but I was still clinging to a few cherished myths. When I read the book, it was a major step towards my enlightenment. It helped me answer the big question I've been asking. What happened to the constitutional republic the founders gave us? Have you had other people express a similar awakening from reading that book?
Well, yes, I have. It was, the book was number 2 in sales on Amazon.com a couple of months after it came out in 2002. And I've had thousands of emails over the years of people saying that, exactly that. And I guess the key to understanding this is that the original design of the Constitution, in the mind of the Jeffersonians anyway, of Thomas Jefferson and his followers, was that if the citizens were to be the masters rather than the servants of their own government, their own federal government, then the vehicle would have to be political organizations at the state and local level. And you could never trust the federal government itself to be the judge of what the limits of its powers would be. The citizens would have to take it into their own hands. That's why the original founding generation all advocated secession as a natural right, nullification of unconstitutional federal laws, and of course, America was created by a war of secession from the British Empire. And so, but the Civil War changed all that, because after the Civil War, in one of my books, Lincoln Unmasked, I quote Woodrow Wilson back when he was a professor as praising and cheering on the fact that after the Civil War, the federal government became the sole arbiter of constitutionality through the Supreme Court. And of course, what eventually happened was just what the Jeffersonians warned against, that the government, through its own courts, would eventually decide that there are no limits to its powers.
The point you made that the Civil War changed the characteristics of America is what led me to the conclusion that the constitutional republic our founders gave us ended in 1865.
Yeah, well, if you look at all the founding documents, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, whenever the words United States are in there, they're always in the plural, and the states are referred to with the word them. Even the definition of treason in the Constitution, Article 3, Section 3, defines treason as only, it uses the word only, as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to their enemies. And that meant the states, the free, independent, and sovereign states. And that, of course, is exactly what Abraham Lincoln did when he invaded the southern states, is to commit treason. And so after the war, that's when we adopted this idea of the United States being one consolidated monopolistic government. And we started saying the United States is rather than the United States are. And that was the end of the original system of federalism that was created by the founding fathers. And from that point on, we essentially developed a sort of a European-style mercantilist empire where government for the privileged few became the dominant credo of the government.
Congressman Ron Paul, in an interview with Tim Russert on Meet the Press in 2007, said, "Every other country in the world got rid of slavery without a civil war. How much would that cost compared to killing 600,000 Americans when the hatred lingered for 100 years? Is the myth that the Civil War was necessary to end slavery the hardest for people to reject in your estimation?"
Well, it is for now, because hardly anyone knows about this. This is one of the best kept secrets in the world, that all the rest of the world, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French, the Danes, the Dutch, the Swedes, people from Massachusetts, New Yorkers, people from Illinois, they all ended slavery peacefully. There's a book called Slavery in New York that was published by the New York Historical Society. It shows that slavery existed in New York City until 1853. Who knows this? The slave ships were built mostly in New York, Boston, and Newport, Rhode Island, and they used slaves to build the slave ships. And so slavery existed everywhere in the United States, at the beginning of the Republic, and everyone in the world found a way to get rid of it peacefully. And Ron Paul was right. One book I would recommend on this is a great book that catalogs all of this. It's called Greatest Emancipations, and the author is Jim Powell. And he just goes chapter and verse of how all the rest of the world ended slavery peacefully. And of course, the latest estimate of the deaths of the American Civil War has been updated by modern researchers to as many as 850,000. For 100 years or more, historians have thought 620,000 was a number, but now it's as much as 850,000. And this was at a time when the population of America was about 1/10 of what it is today. So that would be the equivalent of 8.5 million deaths, supposedly in the name of saving the Union and freeing the slaves. As I argue in my writings, it was totally unnecessary to have a war to free the slaves, because it was not necessary anywhere else on earth in the 19th century.
That is astounding to comprehend because millions of Americans have been taught in public school that the primary reason for the Civil War was to free the slaves. In fact, from what I can remember from my public school education, it was presented in such a way to seem like it was the only reason. Yet, the slogan used at the time was "Save the Union, not free the slaves."
That's, Lincoln himself, he wrote a famous letter to the newspaperman Horace Greeley, where he said, my sole objective is to save the Union, and if I could do that without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could do it by freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would do that too. And then the United States Congress also declared to the world in 1861 that the purpose of the war was to save the Union and not to interfere with what it called the domestic institutions of the states, by which they meant slavery. And so it was, the whole world was informed at the time that this has nothing to do, the invasion of the southern states has nothing to do with freeing any slaves. In Abe Lincoln's first inaugural address, which any of your listeners can read online, he bends over backwards saying, "I have no intent to disturb slavery, and even if I did, it would be unconstitutional." And he even supported in that speech a constitutional amendment that had already passed the House and Senate that would have forbidden the federal government from ever interfering in slavery. And so I consider Lincoln's first inaugural address to be the strongest defense of slavery of any American politician in history, because it came from the president on Inauguration Day. But in the same speech, though, he says, "It is my duty to collect the duties and imposts, that is, tariff taxes on imports from abroad." And in the next sentence, he says, "But beyond that, there will be no invasion of any state." So he's literally threatened a military invasion of the southern states, which was a clear definition of treason under the Constitution, over tax collection. And he kept his promise, because at the time, the tariff on imports accounted for about 90 to 95% of all federal tax revenues. So when the southern states left, they took with them a very large chunk of federal tax revenues, and the Republican Party had plans to be an empire that would rival the British Empire. And you can't be an empire without an endless stream of income, as we all know, we taxpayers all know all too well today. And so that's the reason Lincoln himself gave for launching an invasion, tax collection.
I've told people that, in my opinion, Lincoln was America's first emperor. He destroyed the constitutional republic and laid the foundation for an American empire. Am I exaggerating, or is that an accurate summation?
That's exactly what happened, because if you look at what happened in the years after this, the only check, in my book, The Real Lincoln, I quote Lord Acton, the famous British historian of liberty, in a letter that he wrote to General Robert E. Lee in 1866. And I could paraphrase it. He said, "Secession filled me with hope." That is, he said secession was the only last available check on the sovereign power. That is, it was the only thing that was stopping unlimited government. And of course, people who are advocates of unlimited government throughout history have always wanted to use government as to build an empire of sorts, to give themselves money and riches and glory. And that was the battle in America in the 19th century over the Jeffersonian vision of limited constitutional government versus the vision of the Whig Party and then later the Republican Party of an empire that would spread all the way to China. And so immediately after the war, the first thing the U.S. government did was to wage a 25-year campaign of genocide against the Plains Indians. And General Sherman himself was in charge. And the reason he gave in his memoirs for this was to make way for the government-subsidized transcontinental railroads. And so that was certainly an imperialistic venture. And again, it was unnecessary to murder as many as 60,000 Indians, which is what happened, to build railroads. There was a man named James J. Hill who built a privately funded transcontinental railroad called the Great Northern without a penny of government aid and without any land grants. So it was possible to do that. And so then after that, of course, we got into the Spanish-American War, which was none of our business. And that was really our stepping stone to an empire. There was a famous Yale libertarian sociologist of the late 19th century named William Graham Sumner. He wrote a famous essay called The Conquest of America by Spain. And his point was when we tried to take over the parts of the Spanish Empire, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and so forth, we became Spain. We became an empire. And so I think that's correct. So by the time you get to the 1880s, America had turned into an empire, and of course it got even worse during World War I when we tried to remold the entire continent of Europe under the Woodrow Wilson administration.
I've noticed that you have been on the hit list of the Southern Poverty Center. They shamelessly accused you and others of being racist, even insinuating that you have been involved with white supremacy groups. I can tell just by the way you've been answering the questions, that is ludicrous. You pointed out the fact that the post-Civil War federal government conducted race-based wars. What is your response when you are accused of being a racist?
The modus operandi of the Southern Poverty Law Center is to send out mailings to the less educated, elderly black people in the country to persuade them to send them their Social Security checks by telling them there's a Ku Klux Klan guy around every corner. You know, they've issued these so-called intelligence reports smearing the Constitution Party, Oath Keepers, Ron Paul, Rand Paul, anybody who is a critic of big unlimited government. They try to insinuate that they're a racist, a terrorist, a criminal, something like that. And they're just really, and they're sitting on, by the way, an endowment reportedly of over $100 million. So if they're a poverty center, why are they sitting on a hedge fund essentially of $100 million? You have to ask yourself that. But that's their shtick, is to frighten less educated, elderly black people essentially into giving them all this money, $100 million they're sitting on. By insinuating that people who talk about secession want to bring back slavery or something like that. And that's of course, the craziest thing in the world. Who the heck is ever in favor of anything like that? But apparently there are some people who believe these things and will send a check for $100 or $50 or whatever to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so they're very shameful about that. And so, if you look at the secessionist tradition in America, and the tradition of nullification, the founding generation all believed in it. Thomas Jefferson in the 1820s was still writing letters to people saying he thought that America would break up into different confederacies, and he said we would wish them all well because they're all our children. And that's very different from Abe Lincoln's pay up or die philosophy. And so if you want to know what I think of the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can go to LouRockwell.com and read my article entitled Racial Racketeering for Fun and Profit, the Southern Poverty Law Center Scam.
It's outrageous how they use racism charges to slander people telling the truth about our history and the truth about secession. That leads me to my next question. Secession is gaining popularity here in Texas. In your opinion, is secession a realistic possibility in the near future?
Well, I think it is. You know, the Soviet Union imploded by a dozen or so peaceful acts of secession, and that's how it devolved. And some of the former Soviet republics are doing pretty well. Estonia did really well the first couple of years after the end of the Soviet Union, and others not so well. And the key ingredient is the ones who adopted sort of a European-style welfare state are floundering, and the ones who moved a little more in the direction of freedom are doing much better economically in terms of the former Soviet Empire. And, I just had dinner with an old friend of mine from Italy. He lives in Milan, Italy, and he's a college professor. He doesn't make a huge amount of money, and he pays 58% of his income in federal taxes, and then, of course, state taxes in Italy. And then, like us, he pays a sales tax on just about everything he buys, and he's trying to escape. And so once that Americans are in that position, I think that'll be the motivation. Once we realize that, we're going to have to pay 75% of our income in tax to support the welfare warfare state, what alternative would we have? I'd like to see it happen before that. And God bless Texans if they're the first ones to do it. I'll move there.
If bumper stickers are a realistic indication, it's gotten very popular in Texas. I think the big motivation is taxes. It seems to take people getting hit in the pocketbook before they are motivated to take action. I've noticed even Democrats are waking up to the fact that Obamacare is not what they thought it was. People on the edge of poverty or in the lower end of the middle income bracket who have part-time jobs with no insurance are getting hit with punitive taxes.
Yeah, I think the whole purpose of the whole design of Obamunism, as I call it, is to totally destroy the private health insurance industry and to make people very, very unhappy with the bureaucratic disaster that is about to befall us. so that the only alternative is a total government takeover and government financing of all health care, Canadian style or British style, or Soviet style for that matter, Cuban style. A friend of mine who's an American college professor who went to Cuba on a trip of students came back and he said the only health care they have there, real health care, is swim to Miami. And so that's where we're headed, and that's their objective. I think they intentionally want people to be miserable with their health care and their health insurance because they wanted that system to disappear, and so that people will acquiesce in a total government takeover. And once that happens, of course, they really got us. Once your life depends on the decision of some politician, then they can make you do whatever they want you to do, and so that's why this is so horrific. And the Marxist in the White House knows what he's doing.
You believe that Obamacare is intended to be a disaster. It's part of a plan. I have the same feeling about the new Lincoln movie by Spielberg. The timing of it, combined with all the comparisons of Obama to the mythical Lincoln, seem like intentional propaganda to me. It's no secret Hollywood is in bed with the federal government. Do you think my suspicions of a coordinated effort are correct?
Oh, sure. Hollywood is especially in bed with the Democratic Party, not just government in general. They kowtow to both parties, but the Spielberg movie is an especially egregious example of propaganda aimed at boosting the Obama administration. And there have been web articles all over the place praising the movie because, what is the movie about? Well, it's about Lincoln's unconstitutional acts and his trashing of the Constitution. They mention his suspension of habeas corpus. He behaved like a dictator. Generations of historians have referred to the Lincoln dictatorship, but they say he was a good dictator, a benevolent dictator, and which is, of course, is nonsense, but that's what they say. And so I think Spielberg's purpose is to get people to think, well, yeah, if the current government behaves in a dictatorial manner and they impose socialized medicine on us and a massive increase in redistribution of income, it's the enlightened thing to do because Abe Lincoln did something like that. He ignored the Constitution also. And then on top of that, the Spielberg movie is based on a total lie. The theme of the movie is Lincoln supposedly using all his political tricks and underhandedness to help get the 13th Amendment passed the House of Representatives. That's the amendment that ended slavery. But our preeminent Lincoln scholar of this generation is David Donald of Harvard University. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, and in his biography of Lincoln, what he says about this is Lincoln did virtually nothing to get the 13th Amendment passed. He was even asked by the real abolitionists in Congress, people like Thaddeus Stevens, to assist them with some Democrats in New Jersey who they thought they could persuade to vote for the 13th Amendment. And Lincoln's response was, no thanks, I'm not going to help. And so the actual history is exactly the opposite of the story told in the Spielberg movie about Lincoln and the 13th Amendment. So not only is it a propaganda film for unlimited government, but it's based on a big lie.
This is very disturbing because when people don't understand history accurately, they are vulnerable to being manipulated by propaganda. It's not pleasant to contemplate, but it's been very successful. It's to the point that collectivists who worship an all-powerful government have become bold, and gone is subtle incremental steps that have been the tactic for decades. Now it seems they are confident they can make radical changes all at once. Do you think this is accurate?
Well, they know that the Constitution is finally dead as a check on government power, thanks, very considerably to the Republican Party. After 9/11, the mantra of the Republican Party was 9/11 changed everything. For years, if you listen to Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or any of the other neoconservative talking heads, they said that over and over and over again. Anytime someone like Judge Andrew Napolitano would come on their show and say, wait a minute, the Constitution doesn't allow for something like the Patriot Act, for example, they would say the mantra, but 9/11 changes everything. That means the heck with the Constitution. We're in a war on terror, as George Bush used to call it, T-E-R-R-A. And so the hell with the Constitution. And the leftists, of course, were applauding that and smiling And so now you have both political parties who are on record as just ignoring the Constitution. And now that the left is back in power at the federal level, I think they feel totally justified in just ignoring any kind of constraint on government. Obama's wife is even championing the cause of federally subsidized breast pumps for pregnant women. And I thought Bill Clinton's Surgeon General was kind of crazy when she thought the Constitution allowed for federally funded masturbation education programs. That's what eventually got her fired. But that was just the beginning. You know, if that's constitutional, anything is constitutional, and that's where we are today.
It's incredible. We have welfare recipients now entitled to having cell phones given to them at taxpayer expense. The level of graft and corruption is astounding. I do, however, take some comfort in remembering that it was a small group of people that led the effort in the founding of this once great republic. It's going to take an irate minority dedicated to waking up the masses, to borrow from Samuel Adams. I'm convinced that profound ignorance of accurate history is a major reason Americans have been so successfully propagandized into accepting a tyrannical government. Is there any signs that the teaching of history is improving in the public school system?
Not in the public school system. It's only getting worse and worse every year. You know, I've been a university professor for 32 years, and I've seen it getting worse and worse, and the students less and less prepared every year during that whole time. But the internet has changed a lot. The online courses you can take, you can educate yourself, and all you need is one person to point you in a different direction than the official line of the public schools. And I get hundreds, maybe even thousands of emails from students every year who have read some of my articles or books, and they want to use them for their papers that they're preparing for their courses at the university level. And I have hundreds of colleagues in the academic world who are free market, freedom oriented, who are the same, do the same thing. So we do have a pretty big counter movement, you know. My old friend Gary North uses a sort of a biblical language. He calls it the remnant. He says that what we have to rely on is the remnant to save us, if we are to be saved and have some semblance of freedom in the future. And I guess that refers to the remnant who sort of spread Christianity in the early days, as opposed, in spite of all the persecutions that were going on. But so he likes to think of it that way, and you're right. The American founding generation, they had their remnant that helped us secede from the British Empire.
In light of your observations that the public school system is getting worse and it's going to take people re-educating themselves, what first step do you recommend for people who need to start at the beginning? A history 101, if you will.
Learning real history. Well, I would get a hold of a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History by Thomas E. Woods. That's one thing I would do. And once you get that, you'll see there's a whole series of so-called politically incorrect guides. There's one on the Constitution, there's one on the Founding Fathers, and they're all very good. They're all published by Regnery Publishing Company, and they're all written by good scholars who know how to write and communicate, and they're all written at a very basic level that any junior high school student should be able to understand. So they're great resources for your kids and your young people as well as anybody else. And the websites I would point to is LouRockwell.com. Also, Mises.org, Mises.org. And there's also something called Future of Freedom Foundation, which is FFF.org. They're all sort of along the lines of the Ron Paulians in terms of their political philosophy. And you'll find some good economic education in there and some good historical education as well.
That sounds like a great starting point for people. This show will be in the archive so folks can get that information if they missed it. Mr. Dilorenzo, I appreciate you taking time to share your knowledge with the Pursuit of Freedom listeners. I believe that this is critically important because it's been a disaster for this country to have so many Americans ignorant of their own nation's history. It's why people can't make informed decisions as to the course this country should take. I wish you continued success in the work you are doing.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure, and I'll be glad to come back anytime.
The Pursuit of Freedom, the show for people ready to take back their republic.